Hey, Salem Phillips. Today we wrap up our ministry series on global engagement with Dr. David Busick, who is a general superintendent in the Church of Nazarene. Now, for some of you who don't know the general superintendent language, it's like a bishop. Anyway, there are a number of general superintendents who are responsible for and love on and pray on and visit the whole globe, more than 2 million Nazarenes. So it's our privilege to have Dr. Busick, who has been a scholar, he's been a pastor, he's been an academic, but more than anything else, he loves the church and he loves the gospel, and he's passionate about making Christ-like disciples in the nations. So I know you're online, but would you give Dr. David Busick a warm Salem Fields welcome as he ministers to us today, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Greetings, Salem Fields Church. It's so good to be with you today. Thanks to Pastor James for this invitation. We're excited to share with you a little bit from God's Word. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me, please, to Matthew chapter 13. And we're going to pick up the reading with verse 1. Matthew chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. This is what it says. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. This is God's word for us today. So this is a very famous story of Jesus. This is what we call a parable of Jesus. And I know that it's a famous parable for a couple of reasons. But before I tell you what those reasons are, let me tell you what people sometimes call this story, this parable. Sometimes they call it the parable of the sower, because they put the emphasis on the person who's sowing the seed. Other times, though, people call it the parable of the soils, because these soils, these different kinds of ground, they represent different heart conditions of people. So it's perfectly appropriate if you want to call it the parable of the sower, or if you want to call it the parable of the soils, both of those work. But I want to approach it from a different angle today. And that is, I want to call this the parable of the crazy farmer. And I want to call it the crazy farmer for a couple of reasons. But let me tell you why this parable is so important for us here today. First of all, we know this was an important parable for the early church, and here's why we know that. It appears in all three of the first Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's one of the only parables that appears in all three. The second reason we know that it was an important parable is because Jesus actually explained it. In most of the other parables of Jesus, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus doesn't give us endings. He just kind of leaves us hanging. And part of why he does that is because the nature of parables is to work on us. It's to percolate in our heart and in our soul, to try and transform our way of thinking. It's like a ticking time bomb. It's tick, tick, tick. It works on us, tick, 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 until finally there's an explosion. And with that explosion, it shatters our old way of thinking, and it gives us a new way of thinking about things. And so that's how Jesus normally told the stories that he told. This one, however, he explains. If I had gone on and read the rest of this parable, he would have explained every detail of the first part of this story. He would tell us what the birds were. He would tell us what the ground represented. And he would tell us how the kingdom of God works in the life of planting seeds. So for those three reasons, this parable of the crazy farmer is a really important story from Jesus. Now, there's three reasons why I think this is called the parable of the crazy farmer. The first thing I want you to see about this crazy farmer is I want you to see the indiscriminate extravagance of this farmer. You notice here that there's 4 heart conditions that are talked about. There's 4 soils. Jesus talks about the hard ground. And this represents the heart of a person who when the gospel seed goes onto their heart is hard, and the seed has a hard time penetrating the surface of that soil. And people's hearts are hard for a variety of reasons. Sometimes when you see a path along the ground, it's because it's been walked on. Some people's hearts are hard and resistant because they've been walked on in life. And so some people have hard hearts. The other heart condition Jesus talks about is the shallow ground. And he said this is the ground where the gospel seed goes onto this heart, and the crop springs up quickly because it has, it's barely beneath the surface, but as soon as the sun comes out and begins to scorch that seed, it doesn't have any depth of soil, and the roots haven't gotten down deep, and so it withers and it dies. And Jesus said some people's hearts are shallow like that ground. The third kind of heart that Jesus mentioned, the third soil condition, is the weedy heart, the thorns and the thistles. This is the worried heart. This is the distracted heart. Sometimes people's hearts are so full of anxiety and the pressures of this life that when the gospel seed falls onto their heart soil, that the weeds come and choke it out before it has a chance to grow into a mature plant, a mature gospel plant. Some people's hearts are hard. Some people's hearts are shallow. Other people's hearts are full of anxiety. But Jesus also said there's such a thing as a fruitful heart. That's the ground where the gospel seed falls on that, the good news of Jesus Christ, and it not only begins to produce a growing plant, but it begins to reproduce a harvest until it multiplies 100 times over. It's important to know the different kinds of heart conditions that people have. That's true around the world. Now, you need to know something as an aside, how first century farmers planted their fields. Now we here in Virginia or in other places, we plant fields with great order. We have rows that go along. You're driving down a highway and you look over to the side and you see a cornfield, and it's just row after row after row. It's very systematic. People put in those seeds, and that's how we plant fields. But that's not how they planted fields in the first century. What a farmer would do is they would find a good plot of ground that they felt like was going to be fertile soil. But then they would, instead of planting in rows, they would just go and they would plow it all up, just kind of indiscriminately plowing up that field. And once the ground, the topsoil had been broken, then that farmer would take a bag of seed that he had with him, and he would throw it into the areas where it had been plowed up. But he was still careful with the seed because the seed was important. The seed was valuable. And then once he had thrown the seed on the plowed up area, then he would plow it again and cut that seed down into the ground until it had a chance to begin to grow in that plowed up area. But he was still careful with the seed because seed was a precious commodity in the first century. But I want you to notice what this farmer does. The first reason that this farmer is crazy is because he's reckless. I mean, he doesn't just throw seed onto the part of the soil where it's been plowed up. Look at what he does. He scatters it everywhere. Now, he throws some of it onto the good soil, but then he sees some rocks over there, and he says, I think I'm going to throw some seed over on those rocks. And then he sees some weeds over here, and he takes some of that seed and he throws it over into the weeds. And then he sees a path over there, and he takes the seed and he throws it over onto the path. There's all kinds of ground conditions around him, but he doesn't focus just on the good soil. He throws it everywhere. And people who would be hearing this would think, why is he being so careless? Why is he not being more careful? Why is he being so reckless and extravagant with that seed? It's almost like the soil condition doesn't matter to him. He throws it on the path. He throws it on the rocks. He throws it in the weeds. It's almost like he felt that there was more than enough of that seed to go around. that seed represents the gospel. So the first thing I want you to see why this farmer is crazy is because he's just throwing seed everywhere. The soil condition doesn't seem to matter to him. But the second reason I think this farmer is a crazy farmer is because he has an audacious confidence. I want you to see where his confidence lies. Where is his confidence? His confidence is not in the potential of the soil, but his confidence is in the power of the seed. I want you to understand that. We're talking about the gospel seed. We're talking about global missions. We're talking about reaching the world for Christ. I want you to see this story of the crazy farmer, that his confidence is primarily not in the potential of the soil. His confidence is in the power of the gospel seed. Now, this is important to us today because when it comes to our witness in the world, when it comes to us throwing gospel seed, evangelism, outreach, reaching people for Christ, sometimes we put all of our focus on the condition of someone's heart. We think, is the heart soil right? Because we feel like our resources are limited. And so we don't want to just kind of indiscriminately throw our resources and we think they're going to waste. You know, sometimes with the Church of the Nazarene, when we think about going into world areas, we're right now in 164 world areas. We have more than 2.6 million Nazarenes around the world. And sometimes when we think about where are we going to put the World Evangelism Fund, where are we going to take the monies that are given to us from our churches from around the world, we want to put it in the most productive places possible. We sometimes think, let's not put that seed into places where it's hard soil, where it's hard ground, where the gospel's real, it's hard to penetrate the gospel. Maybe it's an Islamic country or whatever it may be, where it's 1% Christian. And the problem with that philosophy, though, is that we're looking at primarily the potential of the ground. We're not focusing on the power of the seed. The power of the gospel seed can go to any ground, any place, anywhere, and we trust that it can do its work in that place. Let me give you a story about that. It's the story of Cordoba, Argentina. Now, Cordoba is a very, very secular city. It's probably one of the most secular cities in all of Argentina. It's the heart of where all of the universities are for them, and so it's a very atheistic culture. It's estimated in the city of Cordoba that perhaps 25% of the population there may be atheistic or agnostic in their belief, and that's what they're reporting. It is very hard ground for the gospel. In fact, in this one particular part of the city of about 1 million people, there's only 3 churches right there. In 1 million people, there's a Mormon church, there's a Catholic church, and there's a Church of the Nazarene. Why is there a Church of the Nazarene in such a hard ground place? And how did it get there? Nazarene missionaries Junior and José Rodriguez, they came from Brazil. And in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, so they had to learn a new language. They had to learn Spanish to go to Argentina, and they're crossing cultures, so they're Nazarene missionaries. They're supported through the World Evangelism Fund, which you get to participate in. And when they went to Cordoba and they were trying to find a place, they're church planters. Now, this is like their 4th church that they planted in Argentina. Very successful, fruitful church planters. And when they got to Cordoba, they started looking for a place to meet as a church, and they found that the real estate was extremely expensive. But they found one part of town that had been gentrified, and it was very, very expensive. But there was one little storefront, a 2-story storefront, that seemed to be way below market price. And they couldn't understand why it was so much less expensive until they found out what that place had been. For many, many years, for more than 20 years, in fact, that place had been an illegal abortion clinic. And not only had it been an illegal abortion clinic, but the woman who ran that clinic had died in that house, and they hadn't found her body for more than 6 months. And so everybody around there, they thought that place is cursed. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And so the price was dropping. But the Church of the Nazarene said, we'll take it. We're going to take this place of death and we're going to turn it into a place of life. And we're going to take this place of darkness and we're going to turn it into a place of light. And that's exactly what Junior and Josie Rodriguez did. They took that storefront and they began to transform it as a place where people could find Jesus. And the church began to grow. And today, in the Cordoba Church of the Nazarene, it runs from 75 to 80 people. Now, in a place like Salem Fields or a place like Virginia or the D.C. area, that would be like saying 10,000 people are going to that church. It's an amazing, fruitful place. But here's the side story I want you to hear about. There's a little tree in the back patio of their house. Junior and Josie and their two girls, they live on the upper story of that storefront, and then the church is on the bottom. But in that back patio, there's one peach tree. There's one single peach tree. And for many, many years, that peach tree never produced a single fruit. It was a fruitless tree until Junior and Josie moved in and until the Church of the Nazarene moved in. And all of a sudden, that fruit tree in that backyard, it couldn't stop making peaches. It produced so many peaches, they were falling onto the ground. And they couldn't eat them all. Some of them were falling over into their neighbors' yards. One day, Junior and Josie got a knock at their front door, and Josie went to answer the door. It was their neighbor lady. They knew that she was an atheist herself. And as soon as she saw her at the door, Josie said these words, "I'm so sorry. I think I know why you're here. It's the peaches, right? We're sorry for the mess that it's making. We're going to clean that up as soon as we possibly can." And the woman said these words to her. She said, "Oh, it is about the peaches, but it's not because I'm upset. It's because I have a question for you. I've lived here for 20 years as well. I know what this place used to be. And I also know that that tree in that backyard never produced a single peach until you moved in. And I just have a question for you. What spell did you put on that peach tree? Because I have a tree in my yard, and I want you to put a spell on that as well." And Josie just laughed, and she said, "Oh, there's no spell. But let me tell you what I think is happening here." And she, in a very conversational way, she just began to share about the good news of Jesus and how when Jesus comes into a place, not only does he change and transform lives, but he also transforms all of creation, and everything is blessed because of the presence of Jesus in that place. And that atheistic neighbor woman was so captured by that testimony that she said to Josie that day, "I'm interested in knowing more about Jesus. Do you think we could have some coffee conversations and you could tell me more about Jesus?" So for the next few months, Josie met with her neighbor. And today I want you to know that that neighbor woman next door to that Cordoba church is a born-again Christian. Not only that, she's a member of Cordoba First Church of the Nazarene. All because there was one peach tree that couldn't stop making fruit. You know what we're talking about there? We're talking about the fact that the issue for us, when we talk about global evangelism, it's not about the condition of someone's heart. They can be hard-hearted. They can be shallow-hearted. They can be full of anxiety and pressure. They can be so secular that they would never believe or have faith in anything. But the point is not the potential of someone's heart. It's the power of the gospel seed. That's what makes the difference. The crazy farmer, the indiscriminate extravagance, throwing the seed everywhere. Why? Because his hope was not in the ground. His hope was in the power of the gospel. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back in just a minute, and I'm going to give you the final idea of why this is a crazy farmer. We'll be back in a minute. The hope is in the gospel. The hope is not in the potential of a person's heart. The hope is in the seed of the gospel that can go into any heart, in any place, no matter how hard the ground, and it can change someone's life. Listen, Jesus said, "I am the vine, you are the branches." He said, "Apart from me, you can do nothing, but with me all things are possible." And one of my prayers for Salem Fields Church is that God will give you an audacious hope because you're so connected to the vine that you'll begin to see the potential of ground all around you, not just in giving locally, not just in giving for this city, but in beginning to have a vision for what it means to be a sowing church around the world. Why was this farmer crazy? First of all, the way he spread the seed. Second of all, his hope in the gospel. But let me give you one more. And I think this is the one that astounds me the most. And that is the persistent patience of this farmer. The patience of this gospel farmer. Over the past couple of years during the pandemic, I had a chance to do a lot of reading. I didn't travel for more than a year. And I read a really important book that really changed my perspective. It's kind of an academic book. It's probably not one that you're going to go out and buy at a Christian bookstore. But it was called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And the subtitle was The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. It was written by a scholar whose name was Alan Kreider. And this was the fruit of his lifelong work. He actually died before he had a chance to publish this scholarly work. But what he did is he took the early church fathers of the church. In the first 200 to 300 years of the church, that we had fathers that were called Cyprian and Justin and Clement and Origen and Tertullian. Those are names that maybe you've heard of before, but those were the early church leaders for the global church in the first 200 or 300 years. And you got to remember, in the first 300 years of the church, we didn't have the Bible as we have it today. The Bible was still being put together, was still being formed. We also didn't have our doctrine completely put together. Those were done by calling councils together. Global world councils were called from around the world. And so doctrine was being shaped. The Bible was being put together. And so the way that these early fathers would teach the church to try to keep some kind of orthodoxy was they would create treatises. They would write treatises on important topics to them, and then they would send them out so that the churches around the Roman Empire could have them as a basis to kind of keep the church together. It's interesting that Kreider says, in all of my study of those early church treatises, he said, I couldn't find one treatise on evangelism. Why not? Because evangelism was organic. You didn't have to tell people. They were just naturally being a witness. They didn't have to go to class to figure out how to tell people about Jesus. So there was not one treatise he found on evangelism. Secondly, there was no treatise he found that talked about church structure. They didn't have church boards, they didn't have youth groups, they didn't have worship bands, they didn't even have buildings. They were mainly meeting in people's homes. And so you didn't need to write treatises about church structure. And Kreider went through and he said, there wasn't this, there wasn't that, they didn't have treatises on this. But then he said this, but he found 4 treatises on patience. 4 treatises trying to tell the church, that little tiny but yet growing church in the midst of that vast Roman Empire, be patient with the slow in your eyes but unstoppable work of God. It was easy for them to get their eyes on the fact that they didn't see things happening at the pace they wanted to see it happen. They felt oppressed and suppressed. Some of them were being persecuted. And it was easy to begin to think, well, maybe this isn't having an impact. So 4 times these early church fathers said, just be patient. God's timing is not your timing. God is doing something through you that you can't see, but in the course of time, God's going to win. The gospel is going to prevail. Even in the darkest of times, in the most secular of places, in the hardest of grounds, they kept trying to say, you can trust the slow but the unstoppable work of God. I want to tell you one more story. When we grow impatient with the slow in our eyes but unstoppable work of God, sometimes we can try to make things happen. Sometimes we can try to do for God what we think God should be doing. We want to push things along. And when we start trying to push things and push into people's lives and try to do what only God can do for them, we can create a lot of damage. We can create a lot of problems. Think about some of those moments in the life of the church over the first couple of thousand years. Think about the Crusades. Here's an idea. Let's go kill all the people who don't believe like we do. Think about the conquistadors. Here's an idea. Here's one way to try to evangelize people. Let's put a sword to their throat and make them confess Jesus as Lord, or we cut their head off. Now, those are extreme examples, obviously. I understand that. But that's actually what happened in the life of the church when people begin to grow impatient with the slow but steady and certain work of God. When we get impatient, we try to control things. We can manipulate things. And when we do, we can do great damage. But I want to tell you something. No matter how hard the ground may seem, no matter how slow the work may feel, you can trust the certain work of God. I want to tell you one last story. It's a story of a man named Will Bromley. You may not know that name because he was a fairly unknown person, but he was a Nazarene missionary in the 1950s. He was a missionary to Papua New Guinea. Now, in Papua New Guinea, we have a hospital. It's a Nazarene hospital there that you support through the World Evangelism Fund. It's one of the most amazing places I've ever been. It serves the entire Jimmy Valley, and even the government says it's the best hospital that they have in that area. It's run completely by Nazarenes. But my first trip to the Jimmy Valley is 42 miles from where that hospital is, down into the valley. Now, normally that 42 miles would take us on a car here in the United States less than an hour. But in the Jimmy Valley, it's such a rough road and the sheer cliffs, and depending on whether it's raining or not, it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 hours to go 42 miles into the Jimmy Valley. They have potholes in that road so big that entire Jeeps just disappear for a couple of seconds before they come back out. There's rock slides, there's mudslides. I've ridden down into the Jimmy Valley a few times, and I'm hanging on so tight, and I'm just being jerked around to keep from being thrown into the windshield. It is a rough ride. I remember one time I got out of the Jeep in the Jimmy Valley, my Fitbit said, 30,000 steps, good job. Keep it going today. I mean, it's a rough place. I've also slept in the missionary house where Will Bromley built with his own hands. It's one of the few places I've slept anywhere in the world where I slept with all my clothes on and my hood over my head, afraid for all the critters that were running around everywhere. It's a very primitive place. But here's what I want you to know. Will Bromley went down into that valley in 1960 in a family station wagon. How he got down there, I don't know. But that ground was so hard. It was so full of weeds. That it was so resistant to the gospel. Do you know it was 7 years before Will Bromley saw the first convert? 7 years of throwing that gospel seed onto hard ground and weedy ground and shallow ground and no response. You talk about needing some patience. But he kept scattering gospel seed, and he kept believing that the power was not in the potential of the heart, but it was in the power of the gospel, until finally something happened. In 1967, there was a breakthrough. And that seed that he had been scattering on such hard ground, all of a sudden, it began to take root in people's hearts. And one person came to Christ, and a third person came to Christ, and 10 people came to Christ. And before you knew it, there were dozens and dozens of people in those villages that were putting their faith in Jesus Christ because of the faithfulness of Will Bromley. One day, Will Bromley was walking out of that house that he built, and he slipped off the front porch, and he broke his leg. It was such a severe break, they knew that they couldn't help him there. And so they had to figure out a way to get him back up to the Nazarene hospital, but they had no way to drive a car. And so people who live in that village, they carried Will Bromley 42 miles on their backs to the top of that hospital. And Will did not survive the trip. He died before they got there. The missionaries that were there in the hospital, they brought Will's body back down into the Jimmy Valley, in that place where he'd been so faithfully serving. But not only was it Will Bromley, but his wife Margaret and their 3-year-old son. They came back. They came back down into that valley. And you can still see the graveside where Will Bromley's buried, right next to that Nazarene church and that house that he built. Today, it's one of the largest and fastest growing Nazarene districts in the entire world. There aren't hundreds of people in that valley who know Christ. There are thousands. It's a church that's growing and multiplying, just like that fruitful seed and that fruitful ground that Jesus talked about with the crazy farmer. In fact, today, it's the only church of the Nazarene district that's not named for a location. It's named for a person. It's called the Bromley District Church of the Nazarene. The faithful persistence, the patience of Will Bromley, because he knew the power of the gospel was greater than the condition of the ground. Salem Fields Church, I want to say thank you to you. I want to say thank you for being crazy farmers. Crazy farmers are still needed today. And here's the definition of a crazy gospel farmer. You just are extravagantly throwing the seed. Some of you are not just throwing the seed of your resources and your money and your giving, but you're throwing your hearts into the lives of people all around you. And I want you to know that you can afford to be extravagant. You're not just looking at the best ground, but what you're looking at is you know the power is in the gospel. The power is in the work of Christ that can go into any situation in anybody's heart and transform them. And also you trust that while it may not seem fast in your eyes, that in the end, God and God's kingdom is going to win. And so as you think about giving today, as you think about having a new vision and a new faith for the future, here's my prayer for you. I hope you're all crazy farmers. Be the fulfillment of Jesus' teaching and begin to just be extravagant with your lives, extravagant with your generosity, extravagant with your church, and watch what God can do with a bunch of crazy farmers. God bless you, God keep you, and thank you for being a generous church.